Millionaire took his maid to his ex-fiancée's wedding, and what she did shocked everyone. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Inside a vast office lined with dark walnut walls, golden light spilled from a crystal chandelier hanging above. Warm and still, like a paused memory. Michael Carter stood silently in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, a small wedding invitation held in his hand. He wasn't looking at the glittering skyline beyond the glass. No. His gaze was locked on the neat, gold-trimmed card. Stella Whitmore was getting married. And not to him. Michael, the man who never lost a deal, never let anyone walk away from him without a cost, was being left behind. Again. Stella had been the only woman who dared leave him. No dramatic arguments, no closure, just silence. And now, through this card, she was telling the world she had moved on. Flourished. Without him. He didn't feel anger, not exactly. What he felt was far more dangerous. Bruised pride and a cold, calculated resolve. She doesn't get to be the last one to walk away, he muttered, setting the invitation down like it was a contract he never signed. His eyes shifted toward the corner of the room. Khloe was there, quiet, focused, tidying up the papers he had scattered earlier in a fit of rage. Khloe didn't belong in this world. She didn't wear designer heels or carry herself like someone used to being noticed. Her blouse was plain, her shoes soft from wear. Her steps were always silent, her presence unobtrusive, like someone trying not to disturb the balance of a world too far above her. She had no idea that, in the next 60 seconds, her name would become the centerpiece of a very personal scheme. "Khloe," Michael's voice cut through the quiet. She looked up, startled. "Yes, Mr. Carter?" He turned from the window and walked toward her, measured, unreadable. His eyes, sharp and assessing, held no warmth. "I need a companion for an event," he said. "It's a wedding. You'll play the part of my date." She blinked. "I'm your housekeeper, not a date for hire." He smirked, not out of amusement, but with the arrogance of a man who never heard the word no. "I'll pay you enough to never scrub another floor again. Just one night. You dress well, speak little, and make sure everyone sees you, and me, together." Khloe stood frozen. Every instinct told her to walk away. But then, she thought of her mother in that underfunded clinic, the unfinished sketches on her laptop, the design program she had deferred. Again. It wasn't vanity or greed that made her hesitate. It was survival. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a lifeline. She lifted her chin, her voice quiet but firm. "Fine. But just so we're clear, I won't let anyone humiliate me, not even you." Michael paused. For the first time, he truly looked at her. "Deal," he replied. And with that, the game began, a game neither of them knew would change them both forever. It began the very next morning. Khloe was in the middle of wiping down a hallway console when a black town car pulled up in front of the house. The driver didn't speak. He simply handed her a folded note with Michael Carter's bold, deliberate handwriting. "Today is the beginning. Wear something neutral. You won't need it for long." That was it. No greeting. No signature. 30 minutes later, she was in the back seat of a silent car, staring out the tinted window as the city passed by, feeling less like a passenger, more like a piece of luggage in transit to someone else's idea of what she should become. The car stopped in front of Leontine, one of the city's most exclusive fashion houses, the kind of place where no price tags existed, and where the floor-to-ceiling windows served more as displays of power than beauty. As she stepped out, her reflection in the glass startled her, not because of how she looked, but because of how small she seemed compared to the world she was about to enter. Inside, she was greeted not by warmth, but by calculation. A woman in a tailored white blazer approached. Icy eyes, clipped voice, already assessing Khloe like raw material. "You must be Khloe. I've been told we have a lot of work to do." Within seconds, assistants emerged from hidden doors, wheeling in racks of gowns, holding swatches against her skin, circling her like stylists in a reality show. The room was full of mirrors, but not one of them reflected the girl she knew. And still, Michael had not arrived. They started with hair. Her bun was undone with surgical precision. Someone muttered something about volume. Another commented, "She has good bone structure, just needs direction." Khloe said nothing. She wanted to scream, to tell them this wasn't her, that she didn't want the makeup, the manicured nails, the $1,000 shoes that felt more like shackles than luxury. But she didn't. Because somewhere in her pocket was a folded piece of paper, a list, tuition, medications, a deposit for a one-room studio to start her own design work. And that list whispered louder than her pride. Michael entered mid-afternoon. He paused at the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Stylists adjusting straps. One assistant crouched at Khloe's feet, fitting stilettos that clearly pained her. Khloe's eyes met his in the mirror. And for a fleeting second, Michael hesitated. In that moment, something about her expression, that mixture of discomfort and dignity, made his breath catch in a way he hadn't expected. But the pause was brief. "She needs to look sophisticated," he said flatly, "but not artificial. Make it believable. Make it effortless." He turned to Khloe. "This isn't about comfort. It's about control." That word. Control. It hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. "And Khloe?" She swallowed hard and nodded. She had already made her decision. There was no going back now. Hours later, she stood in front of a massive mirror in a fitted black gown, tailored to perfection, elegant and haunting in its simplicity. Her makeup was subtle but precise. Her hair swept back, exposing her quiet beauty. She looked powerful, but also unfamiliar. Behind her, Michael studied her like a sculptor inspecting his final work. He said nothing for a long time, then quietly, almost to himself, "Stella will notice you." Khloe didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because inside, beneath the gloss and the silk, she wasn't thinking about Stella, or even Michael. She was thinking about the cost of pretending, and wondering how many more parts of herself she'd have to silence before this night was over. The ballroom was everything people expected it to be. High ceilings dripping with gold, tables dressed in white orchids and candlelight, servers gliding silently like shadows. The music was tasteful, carefully chosen to project elegance without overpowering the expensive murmurs of wealth and power. And yet, the moment Khloe stepped into the room, everything shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, unmistakably. The noise dipped, conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned, almost as if in slow motion. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from awe, but from confusion, from recognition that someone doesn't belong, and the dawning realization that maybe they've misjudged what belonging looks like. She stood at the top of the steps for a breath too long, not hesitating, but grounding herself. The black dress, tailored flawlessly to her frame, fell in soft folds that skimmed the floor. Her makeup was light but sculpted. Her posture, refined but not rehearsed, carried the weight of a woman who had everything to prove and nothing to give away. Beside her, Michael Carter looked as expected. Cold, composed, immaculate, a man who moved through these rooms with the kind of indifference that only the powerful could afford. But he wasn't indifferent now. He looked at Khloe with a trace of something dangerously close to hesitation, the brief awareness that he had invited someone into this world who didn't fit it, and who, in defiance of that, was owning it anyway. The first 30 minutes were a game of observation. The guests, CEOs, socialites, minor celebrities with exaggerated cheekbones, tried to place her. Was she new money? A designer? Someone from Europe? And then came the whispers, "Isn't that his maid? I heard she worked for him." "That can't be true. Look at her." Khloe heard them. She heard them all. But she kept her gaze forward, her expression unreadable, like a woman walking across a glass floor, fully aware of what lies beneath but refusing to look down. Michael, on the other hand, wore his usual mask of indifference, though it slipped, barely, when he noticed how perfectly Khloe matched the room, and how the room seemed to change around her. She was no longer just a pawn in his plan. She was becoming the story. And then Stella appeared. The bride, a vision in ivory silk and cold diamonds, she crossed the room with the grace of someone who had practiced for this moment her whole life, gliding, glowing, surrounded by murmurs of admiration. When her eyes met Michael's, there was a flicker, not of longing, but of ownership unfulfilled. And when she saw Khloe, something in her expression tightened, but her smile didn't falter. "Michael?" Her voice, as always, was warm honey wrapped around a blade. "You came. You invited me," he replied, smooth but distant. She turned to Khloe, and though her tone remained pleasant, her eyes scanned her like an auctioneer appraising a counterfeit. "And you must be his guest." A beat. "Interesting choice." Khloe didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, not with defiance but with quiet amusement, the kind of look that comes from someone who knows she's being tested and isn't afraid to pass. "You probably know his taste better than anyone," she said softly. "But sometimes people outgrow their past preferences." Stella's smile twitched, only slightly. It was the smallest of victories. But it landed. Michael said nothing. But he turned to Khloe with a look she didn't expect. Not approval, not pride, recognition. For the first time since the night began, he saw her not as a symbol, not as an accessory in his carefully crafted scheme, but as a woman entirely her own, composed, intelligent, and absolutely unafraid. "She's bold," Stella said as she turned away. "You always liked that, until it scared you." Khloe didn't react, but Michael's hand, resting gently at her back, flexed almost imperceptibly, and in that moment the air between them shifted. Later, during dinner, they sat at a table near the center of the room. The conversation swirled around them, meaningless pleasantries, polite laughter. But Michael didn't speak much. He watched. He watched how Khloe answered questions with grace, how she sipped her wine deliberately, as though every gesture was measured, not forced, but thoughtful, controlled. And then came the dance. The string quartet shifted to something slow and cinematic. Couples rose to the floor, and Michael stood. "Dance with me," he said quietly. Khloe looked at him. "You said this wasn't part of the plan." "It wasn't," he replied, "but plans change." The moment they stepped onto the dance floor, the room hushed again, this time for a different reason. Michael Carter didn't dance, and yet, here he was, leading a woman no one could quite place, no one could quite understand, and looking at her as if he finally saw something real in a room full of polished illusions. Their hands touched, lightly, but the silence between them spoke louder than the music. Khloe's fingers trembled once, barely, but Michael steadied her. Their bodies moved slowly, in time with the strings. No one spoke, not them, not the crowd, but in the space between one breath and the next, Khloe looked up, and Michael was already looking at her. No words, no declarations, just one long, deliberate glance that held every unsaid thing between them. And for the first time that night, maybe for the first time in their lives, neither of them was pretending. The morning after the wedding was supposed to be silent. But it wasn't. By 8 a.m., the internet was alive with whispers. Social feeds flickered with blurry photos from the night before. Michael Carter on the dance floor with an unknown woman. Headlines didn't ask who she was. They assumed. Mystery woman at Stella Whitmore's wedding? Carter's new flame? The maid who stole the spotlight? A power play or a love affair? The comments came in waves. Speculation, praise, snide remarks. The tabloids licked their lips. Investors raised their brows. And in the shadows of the ballroom's afterglow, Stella made her move. She didn't speak to the media. She didn't need to. Just a few quiet words over champagne brunch with the right people, people who mattered. She's a clever girl, that Khloe. Michael's always had a blind spot for novelty. Don't be surprised if she ends up with her name on more than a guest list. The damage was subtle. Surgical. But it spread. By noon, Michael was pacing in his office. The blinds were drawn, the air stiff. His assistant hovered outside, too afraid to interrupt. Inside, Michael scrolled through articles with a clenched jaw, his phone buzzing non-stop with questions from board members, headlines forwarded by friends, jabs from former rivals. But it wasn't the rumors that stung. It was what they implied, that he was being used, played. And worse, that he hadn't seen it coming. His pride, already bruised from Stella's wedding, snapped. He didn't ask questions. He didn't investigate. He called for Khloe. She arrived 10 minutes later, still in her work clothes, unaware that the ground beneath her was already breaking. "You wanted to see me?" Michael didn't look up. He tossed a folder onto the desk. Printed screenshots, comments, tagged posts. "Tell me, Khloe," he said coldly. "How long were you planning this?" Her brow furrowed. "Planning what?" "You used me. Played your role perfectly. I have investors asking if you're part of some PR stunt, if you're with me for attention. Were you always aiming higher? Or did you just enjoy the spotlight?" Khloe froze. Not out of fear, but out of shock. "You think I wanted this?" she asked, her voice quiet. Too quiet. Michael's tone hardened. "You had dinner with men I do business with. You had conversations. Made impressions." "I answered questions they asked," she said, still stunned. "I didn't chase anyone. I didn't scheme anything. You told me to show up and play the part. And you played it too well," he cut in. "Now I have to deal with the fallout." The silence was brutal. Then Khloe stepped back, shoulders square. Her voice cracked slightly, but not with weakness, with heartbreak. "You think I did all this to get something from you? You think I endured the humiliation, the stares, the judgment, to gain what? Status? Money?" She shook her head. "You never even asked me what I wanted." Michael looked away, jaw clenched, but said nothing. Khloe stared at him one last time, and when she spoke again, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "You think I came into your world trying to take something. But I walked away from mine to help you fix yours." Then, quietly, she turned and left. No tears, no theatrics, just the soft sound of heels fading into the hallway and the door closing on what could have been. She didn't cry until she got home. And even then, it wasn't loud. It was quiet, restrained. The kind of crying that happens when the heart has broken so cleanly that the mind hasn't caught up. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in the clothes from that morning. Her phone buzzed once, a new notification. She didn't look. For the first time in years, she felt small again. Not because she wasn't enough, but because she had given something real and been thrown aside like it was a trick. And Michael? He stood in his office long after she left. Still. Cold. But in the hours that followed, when the calls died down and the noise faded, something crept in. Regret, not because he might have been wrong, but because, for the first time in his life, he had chosen pride over someone who had never asked to be part of his game in the first place. And he was starting to realize he may have just lost the only person who ever looked at him without wanting something in return. At first, it began as a whisper, a few curious posts on design blogs, some local praise, a quiet feature buried deep in a sustainability newsletter. New face in eco-design, meet Khloe Anderson. But like anything made with soul, with story, it didn't stay quiet for long. Because Khloe hadn't just returned. She had reimagined herself. Her first collection appeared online 6 months after she walked out of Michael Carter's office. It didn't scream for attention. It invited it. A small series of handcrafted home decor pieces, tables made from salvaged wood, scarred but sealed with glass, allowing every imperfection to shine through like history etched in grain. Light fixtures formed from repurposed copper pipes, elegant, industrial, quietly revolutionary, and shelves built from reclaimed doors, each one still holding faint traces of paint from the homes they once belonged to. Every piece had a story. Every line, every curve, whispered of something broken, found, and made whole again. Just like her. Khloe didn't advertise herself. She didn't pose for glossy campaigns or push for interviews. She worked, quietly, relentlessly, from the small studio apartment she had converted into a workshop. She sanded and polished and packaged each item by hand, often late into the night. Sawdust on her sleeves, music in the background, orders trickling in faster than she could keep up. She didn't have a team. She had a mission. Her brand wasn't about glamour. It was about meaning. In a world obsessed with the new, Khloe made old things matter again. In a city of sleek surfaces, she built a space for pieces with memory, with scars and stories. And people noticed. By the end of the season, her name was mentioned in The Green Edit, a high-profile design magazine for sustainable living. The article was short but sharp. Khloe Anderson's pieces don't just decorate rooms, they tell truths, raw, emotional, and real. In a market full of polished emptiness, she reminds us that beauty can grow from brokenness. Michael Carter read it at 11:46 p.m. in his penthouse, alone, half distracted, until her name stopped him cold. The photo showed her standing in front of a display wall of her pieces. Her hands, folded at her waist, were still calloused. Her smile was soft, but certain. The article didn't mention him once. She hadn't used his name, hadn't clung to the drama. She had simply disappeared from his world and built her own. And Michael, for all his power, wealth, and curated success, sat back in his leather chair and felt something gnaw at him. Not regret for what he had said, but for everything he hadn't. In the weeks that followed, he saw her name everywhere, not because he sought it, but because it kept finding him. A client at a gallery praised her custom work. A venture capitalist at a fundraiser referenced that recycled door bookshelf everyone wants. His own sister sent him a photo from a boutique in Portland. Look who's trending. She's amazing. Khloe's world was expanding, and he was no longer part of it. But Khloe wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing something deeper. Peace, purpose, self-respect. For the first time in her adult life, she was building something that didn't depend on anyone's permission. She woke up each morning not to serve someone else's legacy, but to shape her own. And in that quiet, determined work, she found herself again. The Khloe who once walked through marble hallways as a maid, silencing her voice to stay unnoticed, was now signing contracts with eco-friendly retailers. The Khloe who once stood beside Michael in borrowed heels, pretending to belong, was now being invited to design symposiums across the country. She no longer needed to be chosen. She had chosen herself. And Michael? He watched. From a distance he had carved himself. The door she once closed, quietly, respectfully, remained unopened. And somehow, that silence was louder than anything she could have said. It was a Wednesday. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the studio, scattering soft gold across Khloe's workspace. The air smelled of sawdust, lavender oil, and old wood, a scent that had become familiar, almost comforting. Khloe stood at her workbench, gently sanding the edge of a reclaimed oak shelf. Her fingers moved slowly, rhythmically, smoothing splinters she no longer flinched at. It had been months since she'd seen Michael Carter. Months since the words that had broken her, and everything they might have become. She no longer waited for anything from him. So when the knock came, soft against the old studio door, she didn't expect it. He didn't announce himself. He didn't walk in with the confidence she remembered. No sharp suit, no guarded expression, just jeans, a simple jacket, and a silence that seemed to carry its own apology. Khloe looked up, startled. For a moment she didn't speak. Michael stood there, unsure for once of what to do with his hands. He looked around, at the studio, the shelves, the plants in old coffee tins, the calendar covered in deadlines. He looked at her, and lowered his gaze. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I came because I can't keep living the way I was." Khloe didn't move. She held the sandpaper in her hand, her fingers still covered in dust. But her breath had changed. Michael continued. "You saw something in the world I didn't, and I fought it. Because I thought power meant control. Now I know, maybe power means learning what not to hold on to." He exhaled slowly. "I want to build something that matters, really matters, and I need someone who actually knows how." Silence. The only sound was the ticking clock above the window, and the distant hum of traffic outside. Khloe studied him. This wasn't the man who dismissed her. This wasn't the man who weaponized silence, who used money to bend people into roles. This man, standing in her world now, was unfamiliar. And yet, softer. Maybe even real. She didn't speak right away. Her chest rose slowly as she breathed in, as if testing the air for hidden intentions. Finally, she nodded. Once. Precise. Controlled. "I'll come," she said simply, "but only for the project, not for you." Michael accepted that. No protest, no clever line, just a quiet, honest answer. "That's enough for me." They stood there for a moment. Two people who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in a ballroom of lies, now face to face in a studio built from truth. He didn't stay long. He turned, nodded once, and left. No promises, no pressure. And yet, after he was gone, Khloe stood there a little longer than usual, staring at the space he'd been in. Because something had shifted. Not everything, not forgiveness, but something. And in that stillness, the future felt uncertain. Fragile. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth exploring. For a while, everything moved forward. The project, a groundbreaking sustainable design complex, had begun attracting attention beyond the niche circles. Publications reached out, investors flew in, there were whispers about awards. And Khloe? She had gone from the unknown to the mind behind the movement. Her designs, rooted in warmth, humanity, and conscious material use, breathed life into steel frames and concrete beams. People felt something when they walked through her spaces. And they remembered. Michael watched it all unfold. Quietly, respectfully. He didn't take credit, not this time, But peace never lasts long when old ghosts haven't been buried, Stella returned. Not in person. Not yet. First came the tabloid headline, Carter's project co-designed by former Maid, investors cautious. Then the photos, heavily edited. Khloe at Michael's side. One image cropped just enough to suggest intimacy, another darkened to create drama. Headlines spun a narrative Stella had perfected long ago. Social climber plays the long game. The internet did what it always does. It clicked, shared, whispered. And just like that, the project stood on shaky ground. At a high-stakes investor summit held in an opulent downtown hotel, the rumors were thick in the air. You could hear them in the elevator, in the restrooms, in the soft hum of conversations over wine. Michael was there. So was Khloe. But so was Stella. She entered late, always a performance. A crisp white blazer, subtle gold jewelry, not a strand of hair out of place. She looked like victory in human form. She approached Michael during the break, her voice soft but sharp as cut glass. "It's funny," she said, sipping from a crystal flute, "how you traded a chess queen for a pawn. Do you even know who she really is?" Michael's expression didn't shift, but inside something burned. "The question," he replied evenly, "is whether you do." She smiled, tilting her head. "She's smart, I'll give her that. She fooled you, just like she fooled everyone in that ballroom." And then, lower, too soft for others to hear. "You still flinch when I speak. That's how I know you're not over me." He didn't answer. Not then. He waited. The next day, at a formal press conference for the project, the room was packed. Industry leaders, city officials, journalists. Khloe stood to the side, not behind him. By his request, Michael took the stage. His speech began as expected. Numbers, vision, purpose. But then, his tone changed. "There have been questions," he said, looking straight into the sea of flashing cameras, "about who belongs at the heart of this project." He paused. The room stilled. "Let me be clear. If anyone, investor, partner, media outlet, questions Khloe Anderson's role here, I invite you to walk away. Now." There was a ripple of murmurs. Khloe stiffened slightly, not expecting it. "Because I'm not building this for applause or headlines. I'm building this for what matters, and without Khloe there is no project. Without her, there's no truth in any of it." His eyes found hers across the crowd. "This isn't about redemption, or charity, or ego. It's about trust. It's about who shows up when no one's watching." He turned back to the crowd, voice steady. "You wanted a symbol of change? She is the change." The applause didn't come immediately. It built, slowly, one person at a time. But when it did, it roared. Journalists scribbled, cameras flashed. Some investors exchanged looks, surprised, impressed, and others simply nodded, already calculating the power of authenticity in a world so desperate for it. Khloe felt her throat tighten, not from emotion, from relief, because for the first time, someone hadn't just defended her behind closed doors. They'd stood next to her in the light. Stella? She didn't return after that, at least not to the project, because even power, real or imagined, can't survive where the truth has already taken root. Later that evening, as the sun cast long gold shadows across the half-finished atrium of their shared design, Khloe walked quietly beside Michael, hands in her pockets. "You didn't have to do that," she said, barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her, just smiled slightly. "Yes, I did." The rain came soft and steady that afternoon, a whisper on the studio windows. The kind of rain that didn't demand attention, just gently asked the world to slow down. Khloe had stayed late. The new phase of the sustainability project was demanding more of her time, her focus. But it wasn't work that kept her there tonight. It was a question. a quiet hum beneath the surface of every meeting, every interaction with Michael lately. His passion for the project was undeniable. But there was something behind it, something that felt less like vision and more like repentance. And Khloe had never been one to ignore the feeling that something didn't quite add up. She found the file by accident, not hidden, not locked away, just placed behind a stack of portfolios in the conference room filing cabinet. Outdated, dusty, yellowed paper with the company's old logo, Carter Global Developments. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the brittle pages. What she saw shifted everything. Photos of mining sites, reports on land degradation, internal memos written by Michael's father, Franklin Carter, the founder, detailing cost-cutting measures that directly led to environmental damage across multiple continents. There were testimonies, whistleblower notes, fines paid in silence, and stamped at the bottom of one document, closed, all liabilities settled. It wasn't just about pollution, it was about destruction, and a legacy built on turning a blind eye to it. Khloe was still reading when the door opened. Michael stepped in, mid-sentence about a client call, then stopped cold. Their eyes met. She held the folder in her hands, not accusingly, not defensively, just open. Michael closed the door behind him and leaned back against it. His jaw was tight, but his voice, when it came, was calm. "You found it." Not a question, a quiet acknowledgement. For a long moment he didn't speak, just stared past her at the floor, as if deciding whether to explain or run. He chose truth. "When I was 12, he said, my father took me to one of the sites. In the Philippines. He showed me what we were building, the hotels, the roads. But I saw what wasn't in the photos, the dried-up river, the kids playing in dust where a forest used to be, and I asked him, why doesn't anyone talk about that? He said, because they don't pay the bills, Michael. Michael let out a slow breath. His voice didn't tremble, but something in it cracked. I spent the next 20 years learning how to silence that voice. I buried myself in deals, in image, in control. I told myself I was different. But I wasn't. I was just more polished. Khloe didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of presence, anchoring him. He walked over and sat across from her. The folder lay open between them like an unspoken wound. After he died, I found those documents, the payouts, the settlements, the damage, and I realized I didn't want to defend that name anymore. I wanted to rebuild it, brick by brick, with something that could actually stand. He looked at her now. Really looked. That's why this project matters. Not because I want headlines, but because I want to undo something I can never fully fix. Khloe looked down at the photos, then up at Michael. Her eyes softened, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with something harder to define. Recognition. Understanding. She finally saw the why behind his change, not guilt alone, but grief, the kind that ages you in silence, and maybe the beginning of remorse that was ready to build something better. She closed the folder gently. No dramatics, no judgment. Then let's make sure, she said softly, that this time it stands for something. Michael nodded. No promises, no grand declarations, just the quiet, determined look of a man who had finally stopped running from the shadow of his last name. There were no grand declarations, no roses, no candlelight dinners, no hearts drawn in coffee foam or surprise serenades beneath her window. That wasn't how Michael Carter worked anymore, and it was certainly not what Khloe Anderson needed. Their closeness arrived quietly, like the first signs of spring in a city that had forgotten warmth, subtle, unexpected, and strangely disarming. Michael's change didn't announce itself. It accumulated. He started with small gestures, so small most wouldn't have noticed. But Khloe did. He stopped interrupting her in meetings, started asking what she needed instead of assuming, began leaving a coffee cup on her desk, no sugar, extra oat milk, before she arrived. The first time he did it, she didn't even acknowledge it. The third time, she gave him a nod. By the fifth, she quietly placed a post-it on the cup. Appreciated, but not necessary. It was Khloe's way of saying, I see what you're doing, but don't assume that means I owe you more. Michael didn't take offense. Not anymore. The man who once believed respect was something to be bought or demanded was learning the discipline of earning it. And Khloe, she was his lesson. There was one morning that stood out. The rain was coming down in sheets, drenching the city in a silvery haze. Inside the office, the team had gathered for a high-pressure pitch review. The energy was tense. A crucial investor had pulled out the night before. Deadlines loomed. Khloe arrived, hair damp from the walk, documents held tight under her arm. Her usual calmness was strained, but she didn't speak about it. She rarely did. Before the meeting began, Michael pulled out a seat for her, an unnecessary gesture, but gentle. He didn't say a word, just held the chair, then stepped back. Khloe sat. Her shoulders relaxed, almost imperceptibly. Later, during the presentation, an executive challenged one of her design proposals, calling it aesthetic overfunction. Khloe inhaled to respond, but Michael spoke first. Her work is the function. If you don't see that, you're not looking closely enough. There was no trace of ego in his voice, just certainty, respect. Khloe didn't look at him, not right away, but later when they stood alone in the elevator, she broke the silence. That was unnecessary. Maybe, he said, but it was the truth. Her gaze drifted to the floor, then to him. I'm not here because you protect me. I know, he replied softly. You're here because no one else could have built what you built. They said nothing else on the ride down, but something shifted, not in what they said, but in what they allowed themselves to feel. And still, Khloe didn't let the distance dissolve. Michael once left a small, carefully wrapped box on her desk, a hand-bound notebook with her name engraved. Inside, the first page held a quote from Maya Angelou. Nothing can dim the light that shines from within. She didn't reject the gift, but when he saw her later that day, she met his eyes and said simply, Don't try to win me. I'm not, he said. I'm just paying attention. He began quietly supporting the design interns she mentored. He redirected funding toward her sustainability initiatives. He made sure her name, not his, led the architectural submission for the city's Green Innovation Award. And when the announcement came that her project had been nominated, the entire team celebrated. Except Michael. He stood in the back, watched her from a distance, and smiled. But perhaps the most telling moment came one late evening when only the two of them remained at the studio. Khloe was sketching revisions on a conference table, headphones in, absorbed. Michael approached silently, placing a mug beside her elbow. She removed one earbud and raised an eyebrow. Chamomile, he said. You mentioned headaches during late-night design sessions. Khloe blinked, not because of the tea, because he had remembered. She sipped cautiously. Thank you, she said. Then added, not unkindly, but I need you to understand something. He nodded, waiting. I didn't come this far to be someone's success story. I don't want to be the reason you change. I need to know that you would have changed even if I'd never shown up. Michael was quiet for a moment. His jaw clenched slightly, not from frustration, but from how true her words were. I'm trying to, he said. Every day. Khloe nodded once and returned to her sketches. Michael had never met a woman like her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was brilliant, though she always had been, but because she refused to be his. She would only ever be herself. And Michael, for once in his life, didn't want to take. He just wanted to be near enough to earn a place in her story. If she ever was. The airport was quieter than expected. No emotional farewells. No drama. Just Khloe, standing near gate 42, boarding pass in hand, suitcase in tow, eyes steady. 3 weeks. That's how long she'd be gone. 3 weeks to attend a global summit on sustainable design in Vienna. 3 weeks to present her story, her vision, her work. 3 weeks without Michael Carter. And he hadn't tried to stop her. He'd simply walked her to the building entrance the night before, hands in his coat pockets, watching her like a man afraid to speak a truth he'd only just learned to feel. "You'll be great," he'd said. Khloe had smiled. Not the kind of smile that invites closeness, but the kind that says goodbye without saying it aloud. "Take care of the project." She didn't look back when she walked away. Michael had never been good at stillness. His life was a series of negotiations, takeovers, momentum. But the morning after Khloe left, the silence in the conference room hit him like a freight train. Her chair, empty. Her notes, absent. The quiet banter she exchanged with the interns, missing. It wasn't about romance. Not really. It was about presence. Khloe's presence had filled the corners of the office in ways he hadn't realized until it was gone. He sat at his desk, eyes drifting to the digital clock. Vienna was 9 hours ahead. She'd be landing soon. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Khloe watched the city pass by from the back of a taxi. Vienna at night was a mosaic of golden lights, cobblestone streets, and quiet art. Old and new, coexisting with grace. In her hotel room, the air was crisp, the window open just enough to let the city hum inside. She placed her journal on the desk, ran a hand across its cover. The one Michael had given her. Still unused. She didn't hate him. Didn't resent him. But she needed distance to know what part of her journey was truly hers, and what part had been shaped by the gravity of a man like Michael Carter. She wrote a single sentence across the first page. "What we build alone teaches us who we are without influence." Then she closed the journal and went to sleep. The conference hall was vast, wood-paneled walls, skylights like open palms above. On day 4, Khloe took the stage. She didn't read from notes, didn't rehearse. She just spoke. "When I started, I thought I had to fight for space, for voice, for recognition. But now I realize it's not about claiming control. It's about letting go of it." She paused, letting her eyes scan the audience. Architects, innovators, students, CEOs. Real transformation doesn't happen when we get more power. It happens when we open our hearts, when we stop proving and start being. And when we allow someone else to walk into our lives, not to define us, but to witness us. There was silence, and then applause, long, standing. But Khloe only bowed her head gently, walked off the stage, and disappeared backstage into the quiet. Back in his office, Michael sat alone. The live stream screen still glowed on his monitor. He had watched every second, not as a CEO, not even as a collaborator, just as a man who finally understood. This wasn't about Khloe choosing him. It was about Khloe choosing herself, and him learning to respect that. He didn't text her, didn't send flowers, didn't call. Instead, he closed the laptop, sat back in his chair, and smiled. A quiet, wistful smile. Because for the first time, he loved someone. Enough to let her fly without needing to follow. It was after hours. The building had emptied. Only a few lights remained on. soft golden glows spilling onto polished floors, flickering slightly with the city wind. Michael Carter stood in his office, alone. His jacket draped over a chair, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands tucked into his pockets as he stared out over the skyline. From here, the city looked peaceful, but inside him, there was a tension. Something unfinished, something unspoken. That's when he heard the knock. Not loud, not tentative either, just present. He turned, and there she was, Khloe. She stood in the doorway, not moving to step inside. No files, no design samples, no phone in hand, no mask on her face. Only her hair windswept, eyes steady, a quiet firmness in her posture that suggested she hadn't come for business. Michael didn't speak, didn't move. He didn't dare interrupt the moment that hung between them like a held breath. Then Khloe took a step forward and said, plainly, clearly, "I'm not here to talk about the project." Her voice was even. No trembling. Michael swallowed. Slowly. "All right." Khloe exhaled. Then, 3 steps closer now, almost within reach, she said, "I came back because, somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I fell in love with you." Silence. But not an awkward one. The kind of silence that follows something real, something that doesn't need decoration. Michael didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. He closed the distance between them in 2 quiet steps, took her hand, gently, like it might vanish. And finally looked at her like he'd been holding this gaze for weeks. "I've loved you," he said, voice low, "since the day you walked away and didn't look back." Khloe didn't cry. Neither did Michael. They just stood there, hand in hand. 2 people who had fought for control, for independence, for meaning, and somehow had ended up here. Not needing to win, not needing to explain, just choosing to be. Outside, the city pulsed on. But inside that office, time stilled. No one else saw it. No one needed to. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it walks through the door at 9:47 p.m., says 5 words, and waits to be held. It had been months since the project launched. The rooftop, once just concrete, echoing arguments and silent standoffs, had transformed into a living garden. Lush greenery spilled over raised beds. Native plants swayed in the breeze, and in the center, a mural stood tall, painted by a local artist Khloe had chosen. It wasn't just art, it was a story. Their story. From sterile beginnings to fierce disagreements, from trust broken to trust slowly, painstakingly rebuilt, movement and pause. But anyone who knew their journey could read it like a map. Michael had asked Khloe to meet him there. No fanfare, no announcements. Just a quiet evening, as the sun began to soften over the city. She arrived wearing a light jacket and the necklace she always fidgeted with when deep in thought. He was already there, no tux, no crowd. Just a man in a dress shirt, sleeves rolled, palms sweaty though he'd never admit it, and something small hidden in his pocket. They walked the path between the plants in silence for a moment, side by side. Then Khloe stopped in front of the mural. Her eyes traced the journey captured in paint. "It still surprises me," she murmured. "How far we've come." Michael nodded. He didn't say much. He never did when it mattered most. Instead, he took a breath, then turned to her and dropped to one knee. Not dramatically, not perfectly, a little awkward even, but undeniably real. He pulled out a small box. Inside, a simple silver band. No diamonds, no sparkle, just clarity. "I can't promise I'll always get things right," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying in the hush of twilight. "But I promise this, I'll never leave you to fight alone again." Khloe's breath caught. No one had ever said that to her before, not in words that plain, not in a voice that certain. She laughed, choked by emotion, blinking back tears. "Yes, Mr. Carter," she whispered through a smile. "I say yes." He stood, and before he could even reach for her, she wrapped her arms around him. Not because he'd saved her, not because she needed him, but because, finally, he'd become someone she could choose. They didn't throw a grand wedding. There were no headlines, no ballrooms, no white dress under crystal chandeliers. Just the two of them, working side by side, building community gardens, mentoring young creators, restoring spaces left behind by the very empire Michael had once inherited without question. Khloe never gave up her name. Michael never asked her to. They remained two whole people who had learned to walk together, not to lean, but to grow. One spring morning, as they watched volunteers repaint the final wall of a new project, Michael handed Khloe a cup of tea and sat beside her on a bench. He looked at her, not with longing or apology, but with quiet awe. "Thank you," he said, "for teaching me how to love, without needing to win." Khloe rested her head on his shoulder, eyes soft, and for a moment there was nothing more they needed to say. They didn't start with love. They started with a cold agreement, bitter misunderstandings, and silences that felt like they'd never end. But sometimes, two wounded hearts find each other, not because they're perfect, but because they dare to change. Will Michael and Khloe live happily ever after? No one can say for sure, but today, they're no longer afraid to walk the path together. If you made it this far, comment the word love to prove you're a true fan of this series. Do you think Khloe was right to forgive? Do you believe Michael truly changed? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story, filled with love, growth, and unexpected transformation from people who once shut the world out.